So, I get the pleasure of introducing Al Cullen Harvey. Al has worked at the Chadwick Center of Frady's Children's Hospital for over 31 years. So, we're very excited to have him as a speaker today. He's a trauma treatment therapist, clinical improvement coordinator, reflective supervisor and trainer, as well as an LCSW. Um, Co-founder of the Harvey Institute, which is the Harvey Institute is a training and consulting company improves that's the company that is improving healthcare outcomes through the integration of sexual health. And the Harvey Institute won the 2022 William Frederick Lecture Series Award from the Mayo Clinic. So we're very, very excited to have Al here today, and I'm going to let Al take it away from here.
Great. Thank you, Michelle, so much. An incredible honor it is to be here today. Hello, everybody. Lovely to see some of you. I can see some of you in your cameras and others that are here, maybe in places where I can't see you, but I know that you're there. Thanks for joining us. A couple of things from the beginning. You do see in front of you the start of a PowerPoint, and I do have slides that I will be sharing. You'll get access to them. I think you have some access now. You'll have access at the end as well. They really are intended more for resources for you all. I'm not going to literally go through every single slide. There's lots of information in there. A lot of it's kind of heady. Some of it is just anecdotal. I'd rather have a conversation with you, keeping with the theme of today, which is about conversations. So I'm going to kind of riff a little bit with your permission. I'll be honest about that. And honesty is one of our sexual health principles that we're going to talk about today. My most comfort zone for presenting is actually live and in person, where I get to see you, I get to feel your energy. And so this is always a bit of a stretch for me when I'm not actually in the room with you and have to sort of gauge how this is landing and not landing. But I'm going to go to the style that I know most and feel most comfortable with, which is to just talk with you instead of at you. I do encourage some feedback back, so I'll ask questions along the way. Feel free to use the chat. I may ask somebody to speak through voice if they can sometimes, so my voice isn't the only one that's heard in all of this. So with that, if that's all okay for everybody, we're kind of going to move through the material that way. So before we begin, just generally what I'd like to do, what I'd like to accomplish in the time that we have today is to make sure that people have like a general understanding of what sexual health is, what I mean by sexual health. You may have a different definition, but I will tell you what I mean by sexual health. And I want to differentiate it from a kind of a sexual safety approach that I think is what's been the default in our field for so long and really challenge that sort of default position. And I'll tell you in what ways in a moment. I want us to be able to apply some of what you're hearing today in a day-to-day real practice, regardless of what it is that you do. I did get a list ahead of time of who's on the call, and we have quite a breadth of experiences here and disciplines and skill sets and domains. And that's really exciting. Clinicians and researchers and directors and nurses and medical professionals and parent advocates and forensic interviewers. It's quite a collection, which is awesome. And sexual health is an important part of those conversations in all of those domains. And I hope that if you didn't know that or didn't know how to apply it coming into this conversation, that I leave you with at least one or two things that you can apply moving forward, because I think these conversations are so crucial and have been ignored for way too long. We're going to talk about different ways to construct those conversations. One of the most important skills we're going to talk about is this idea of suspending judgment and how judgment often gets in the way of a good, important, real, and honest sexual health conversation. It is often somebody else's fear of the judgment of others that causes them to withhold asking or disclosing something that they really may need to know or need to discuss. And then we're going to hopefully end by kind of making sense of why this is particularly important for youth and families that have experienced trauma. This is important conversation for anybody. I want to start from the beginning. We should be having sexual health conversations in our families and in our agencies right from the beginning. But particularly for those of us that are working with folks that have experienced trauma, I think there's an even double kind of reason why, and we'll go through that. So that's a little what I hope to do with the little bit of time that we have here. One more caveat, and then we'll jump into this. This is really just sort of a teaser workshop. It's to hopefully get you interested, get you more motivated. You're obviously motivated in many ways. That's why you're here, to engage in these sexual health conversations. But it's going to be talking about it from kind of the big picture point of view. I have a whole nother training which is really more skills based. That really requires in-person training. But I will talk along the way about some of the techniques and some of the exercises that I might do or that somebody else might do in a more skills-based training as well to let you know how this could be applied. So I do want you to differentiate between those two. So with that, let's get started. And I'm going to start first by, so I've already talked way more than I prefer to. I'm going to start first with a question for all of you. We have almost 100 of you in this room right now. I haven't even begun to give you my definition of sexual health. But I want you to think about whatever that means to you. And I want you to answer two questions. We're going to do them one at a time. And if I could please, from my folks, have the first poll question up. I'd like you to take a look at this question and think about it. I personally received very useful sexual health information in my youth. Thinking about that for yourself, whatever sexual health means to you, do you feel like you got good sexual health information, yes or no? And again, obviously, this is a confidential poll. Nobody's going to know your answer. So I'm going to give you a minute or two to complete that. Okay, looks like folks mostly have answered as many as they can. I know some of you may be in places where you can't answer the poll because you're on your phone and it can't work that way. So totally get that, no worries. But what we got is roughly 25% of you said yes, 75% of you said no. Now, I've asked this question to multidisciplinary audiences for 10 years. And this group is slightly higher in the yes category, but not that far. Usually you get about a 20-80 split. So you are generally in that ballpark. About 20% of us say, yes, the information that I got growing up from a sexual health point of view, I found useful. About 75% of us, more or less, have said no. That's really important for us to start with that very basic thing. And we'll talk about this in the next section, which is before we even begin to think about having a sexual health conversation with our clients, thinking about what experience do I have with it? What modeling was I given for it? How comfortable am I around terms related to sexual health? So really, really important for us to look at that. So thank you so much for doing that with me. So now we have a second question for you to consider, please. I feel that children and youth served by my organization or agency have received very useful sexual health information. Now, this may be a guess on your part, but based on what you know, the youth that you're serving, do you think they come in to your organization or agency with really practical, useful sexual health information? Yes or no? Okay, looks like we got pretty much a few more there. All right. Not substantively changing the ratio, so that's great. So about 35%, you believe about 35% of you feel that they do, 65% believe that they do not. And again, fairly typical to what we find somewhere around 70-30 split is what I've gotten when I've done this in the past overall. So you're, again, generally within that. So really, really important for us to look at this dynamic. So we looked at the beginning about the fact that many of us have no sort of framework and modeling for a sexual health conversation. And even in the youth that we're serving now, in a population that I would suggest is exposed to sexual imagery and sexual narrative and sexual vocabulary in ways that never happened for our generations. And yet still, many of them, most of them, probably are not coming in with good understanding of sexual health. A lot of exposure to sexual imagery, behaviors, narrative, but not an understanding of what sexual health means. So this is the reason these conversations are important. They're important for us to look at ourselves and be able to grow as professionals. And they're important because we've got a whole new generation. And I would love to come back. I will not be here, but to come back 30 years from now and do this and have all the professionals say, I grew up with good sexual health information. And part of how we can change that demographic is by the work we all do. Obviously, family is important. Obviously, school systems are important. But when clients reach out to our agencies, we have an opportunity to change this dynamic as well and be part of that sexual health conversation so kids don't have to move through this in the ways that they do right now without solid, accurate information. So thanks for doing that all. I really appreciate it. So, making the case for why sexual health belongs in trauma treatment. I think for many of you it may be obvious, but just a couple of things to consider. I have a quote here first from Eli Coleman. I don't know if folks know Eli Coleman or not, but an amazing clinical researcher out of the University of Minnesota. The Coleman Institute now for Sexual Health, named after him. Eli has retired from the University of Minnesota, but certainly a mentor of mine and a pioneer in the field of sexual health. I love this quote from him. Clinicians who fail to inquire about sexual behaviors may miss valuable clinical information. Sexual health, excuse me one second here. My screen is acting up. Sexual health is integral to physical, emotional, and social health across the lifespan. And so these are, again, important conversations to be having with anyone. What is it about sexual health? How do I understand my body and the ways that it reacts and my emotional state as it's related to sexual health? It's a part of our overall sexual health. So if we're going to address people's physical health and emotional health and spiritual health, then we also need to be addressing their sexual health. This is not like a menu where you get to pick and choose which ones. These all create a whole human being. Um, Oftentimes, we don't move into this arena because of our own discomfort. And that's probably the biggest thing that we've learned over and over and over again. What I often hear when I ask people about why they don't engage in these conversations, whether it's social workers, doctors, nurses, parent support individuals, I'm afraid that my client would be uncomfortable if I ask about it. It seems inappropriate to bring it up. And in reality, for those of you that are clinicians, that's what we call a projection. The reality is we more often than not are the uncomfortable ones. And it's our discomfort that drives the conversation. My husband, who I will make reference to later on because we're going to use some of his material, is also a certified sex therapist and an author around sexual health. And he has a phrase which I've learned over time is so accurate. His phrase is that when we want to talk about sex or sexual health, the most uncomfortable person in the room gets to control the conversation. And if you think about that, I think many of you will agree, right? We all, when we are talking about sex or sexual health, we all look for the discomfort and then we ratchet back to not make somebody else uncomfortable. And we need to change that dynamic. Sometimes sexual health conversations are uncomfortable. And the only way to make them more comfortable is by having them and doing them and getting people familiar with them so they don't become this taboo on the side. And when we don't have them, then that avoidance has led to clinical consequences. People feeling shame about who they are because they haven't been able to talk about it, or when they talked about it, they were judged for what they said, when maybe what they were describing is just a very typical sort of innate desire, need, feeling experience that they had. But if somebody else shames me, all of a sudden I'm going to have a whole nother reaction to it. For the youth that we serve, when they're not able to talk openly and honestly and get accurate information from trained professionals, it actually puts them at higher risk of further trauma and further abuse. So I would argue that sexual health conversations are also part of a protective factor that we need and should be providing to our kids if we truly, truly want to end the cycle of abuse and trauma. And many times by avoiding it, it's an important part of the treatment and there are gaps in treatment because of it. A client may be withholding important pieces of the puzzle that we're not able to put together. And it just, I've tried everything. I did the assessment. I'm doing the evidence-based treatment model, and something just isn't clicking with this client. Things aren't getting better, or I sense something else is going on. And it may be that there's an issue there related to sexual health. And because we didn't create an environment that was comfortable for the client, they haven't brought it up. And meanwhile, it may be the key component that helps bring everything else together. So I really would argue that this is super important for us to be incorporating into our work. Oops. Hang on one second here. There we go. I'm going to ask you just silently. You don't need to do this in the chat or anywhere else. Again, based on what we're talking about, when was the last time you asked a client or a parent a sexual health question in a clinical encounter? And again, I'm going to give you my definition of sex health in a minute, so just use your own. But when you think about it, whatever it is, have you proactively asked a client or a parent about some aspect of sexual health for them or for their family system? If you have, what made that possible for you? Did you learn it from somewhere else? Did you have a model for it? Were you taught it in your educational process? Was it brought on by a mentor, a clinical mentor? Just kind of remember that. If you haven't, had you thought about it and yet you didn't? If you thought about it but you didn't, what was the hesitation? Was that your fear of being judged by the client? Ooh, what are they going to make of me if I ask this sexual question? Am I concerned about how my organization might respond to me if they know I asked about some other aspect of sexual health other than what the organization already asks about? What language did you use? What language do you wish you had used? This one I have to revisit all the time. I have tried very hard and very mindfully to grow into my ability to use sexual health language. And I still at times leave a conversation and think, oof, I just worded that so wrong. I can feel the judgment in that, even though I didn't intend it, the way I frame that. And I want to practice getting better at that. What do you imagine that the parent or the child needed in that moment, if and when you were able to ask that sexual health question or invite that into the conversation? So just a little reflection there. I am a reflective supervisor, so we're going to do these periodically. Really important for us to take a moment sometimes and just do our own inventory and see where we are in it. No judgment. Be honest with yourself about it, and then we'll see where we go with it. One quick stat, there's lots that I could pull from. This is one that Doug and I have used in the past just to kind of ground it in a very macro way. Roughly 20%, just shy of 20% of the total global burden of disease, the reasons why people have to seek some sort of medical attention, almost 20% of that is attributable to sexual and reproductive health problems across the globe. And if we look specifically at women, and the reproductive age women, almost a third of all issues that bring them into contact in a medical or mental health profession have to do with some aspect of sexual and reproductive health. So just in general, this is the elephant in the room that we've been avoiding, and at what cost? Just that's just from a medical point of view, and now we're going to talk from an emotional and a trauma focused point of view. So I want to talk a little bit about my own experience and what got me here. Not to just self-reference and to be grandiose, but I hope that it maybe speaks to some other folks as well. And if not, it at least gives you an understanding of where my passion comes from. As you heard in the introduction, I've actually now going on 34 years at the Chadwick Center, which is a child advocacy center based at Rady Children's Hospital here in San Diego. So I have worked in the field of child trauma for 40 years, for almost the entire time that I've been a social worker. I was an accountant in another profession in another time. We will not open up that trauma history. That's for some other time and my therapist to deal with. But for 40 years, I have been a clinical social worker, and trauma treatment has really been the world that I've worked within. I had an interesting conversation a number of years back where I was talking with my husband, who's a marriage and family therapist and a certified sex therapist. And I was showing him some of the assessment tools, the standardized assessment tools that Chadwick was rolling out. This was a while back when many organizations weren't using standardized assessment measures, and so it was very cutting edge for us to be doing it. One of the measures that we were looking at was parents were asked to, they were given a checklist of body parts, and they were asked to check a box next to which body parts does your child know the accurate name for, right? Great, important to know, looking at developmental levels, et cetera, et cetera. I had given that measure out to countless numbers of kids during my assessment process, thought nothing of it, was showing Doug these series of measures we were looking at. He pulled that measure out in particular and he said, I find this really interesting. And I said, you know, what's so interesting? It has, he said, well, look at that. He said, it has what body parts does your child know? And I said, yeah. So what are you noticing here? And he said, well, look at what the words that they're given to choose from. And the words were head, ear, foot, nose, leg. I'm like, yeah, I mean, those are important that kids know those body parts. And Doug said, but what's missing? And at that point, I was a bit in my early stages around my understanding of this. And I said, I'm trying to think like internal, like heart, liver, kidney. He's like, no, those might be missing, but I'm not sure they're all that important. He said, there is no reference to penis, vagina, vulva, anus. These are kids, many of whom are being reported into your organization for some sort of sexual abuse or sexual trauma. And here, even at that place, a parent isn't asked, does your child know the appropriate names for those parts of their body? And it had never dawned on me that right from the get-go, we mentioned these are the names of the body parts a child should know, but we're not going to mention others that might actually have real relevance to the reason that they're there and also speak to their issue of sexual health. So that was my first, kind of from a motivational interviewing sort of framework, for those of you that know that framework, my first sort of, okay, now I'm all of a sudden moving maybe more into a contemplative stage around maybe things need to be a little bit different here. And then the second thing that happened was later, a while later, I was talking with him about some of the conversations that happen in clinical supervision while keeping all the boundaries. I want you to be very clear, but just talking about the tenor and the tone of the things that we talk about, how it is for clinicians to talk about the trauma narrative. For those of you that are not clinicians, bear with me here for a second. Trauma narrative is one technique of many trauma interventions that might be used in therapy, where the therapist and the client have an opportunity for the client to talk more fully about the experience that happened, the traumatic experience that happened. And so it's done in small pieces over time. So a child or an adolescent or even an adult, if it's used with them, gets to fully describe exactly what happened, all the details of the sexual abuse or the sexual trauma, the non-consent, the exploitation. So anyway, I was talking about what it's like for the clinicians to be working on the trauma narrative and the kinds of feelings that it can bring up for them. And at one point in time, Doug said to me, "So when do they talk about the good parts of sex?" So you talk about all the awful things that happened during their trauma, as you should, and I'm glad they get to. When do we talk about the fact that sex can feel pleasurable and sex is an enjoyably spiritual encounter for some people, and sex is a natural and healthy part of our development? When do you talk about that in your work? And I had to admit, we don't. And so I brought that to my team, and it was interesting, their response. And their first response was, oh my God, we would never do that. That would be such bad boundaries. That's not our place. That's not up to us to talk about that. And I really challenged them, and they challenged themselves over time to take a look at, where did that come from? Why did we end up with that sort of thinking in mind? That to help people get through sexual trauma, we help them process the hurt and the pain, but then we sort of leave them there. The metaphor I've come up with that I use sometimes in my trainings is, and hang with me, I work, I used to work with kids a lot. So storytelling, metaphors, there are great ways to teach kids. They like those better than just kind of spelling things out. So the metaphor that I often use is that I think our field, the sexual trauma field, up until recently, has really defaulted to this idea. It's sort of like an individual goes down a ski slope and they trip and fall and they crash into a tree and they fracture their leg. Our system is designed to get that person into the emergency room. We do a great job of x-raying that leg, at seeing, oh my God, there's fractures everywhere, understanding what needs to happen in order for that to be repaired in a way to a certain extent. We can provide a cast or a brace, depending upon the degree of what gets done there. And we put that all together, and then we say to the person, great, okay, that was awful that your leg fractured. Now we've got a cast on it. 10 weeks, 12 weeks, we'll take the cast off, and then you'll be good to go. And then we leave the client there. The problem is that that leg is never going to be the same again. That leg has to learn how to be walked on in a different way. Now, it can be walked on in most cases. Hopefully, the injury wasn't that bad, that it can be walked on again. But we're going to have to walk differently. And we're going to have to learn how to walk again in a great way that I still have the capacity to walk. Our field has left people with, ooh, you had trauma. Yes, it's important that you talk about how bad it was. Yes, we want you to understand it wasn't your fault. Yes, we want to be empathic to the fact that there are going to be lifelong consequences for that. But as you move forward as a sexual being, we're not going to do anything to help you figure out how to navigate that moving forward. If our kids are left with the only understanding of sex and sexual health being that sex is used to hurt, to control, for someone else's pleasure, not at my desire, that it's non-consensual, even if I learned somehow that, okay, maybe that's not right, that shouldn't have been that way, but I'm not given a map for how to move forward from there, then I'm just as vulnerable as before to re-experiencing that sort of hurt and pain. We haven't given kids the mapping for sexual health. We've addressed the sexual trauma, and I think as a field, we've done an amazing job in our ability to do that. But the map forward is an important piece. It's not a one or the other. It is a both. And that's what I'm hoping people will leave here today with a stronger desire to do. So with that, I want to move on a little bit. I'm not going to go through all of that. For those of you that are working in the trauma field, whether that's in medically or mental health or advocacy or from the legal profession, anytime somebody enters our profession, the global field of working within trauma treatment, this isn't just mental health, I would suggest to you. It was anybody that is in that field. When kids come forward, when families come forward, we have an ability to address and begin this conversation. This is from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Some of you may be very familiar with the NCTSN, which is funded by SAMHSA, a federal government agency. It is a collection of organizations and agencies across the United States that are working collectively around the field of trauma and child trauma. And there are committees within the NCTSN. There is a sexual health subcommittee within the NCTSN, which I am very proud to say that I am the co-chairperson of. And we've been in existence for about 10 years, trying to get out good sexual health information for folks that work with children that have experienced trauma. We had a paper come out recently through the NCTSN, and one of the statements that we make in there, as trauma treatment professionals, you develop significant expertise guiding and discussing clinical treatment in terms of risks, consequences, and danger associated with non-consent and exploitation. And that's great. We have. However, prioritization of sexual safety, while essential to current trauma treatment best practices in ACE-informed care, often fails to address client sexual health. So, one of the phrases that you're going to hear over and over and over again from me is that sexual health is more than the absence of sexual harm. And I believe collectively our field has focused on let's try to eliminate or minimize the risk of sexual harm and feel like our work is done here. But that's only half the battle. Sexual health requires more, and we'll talk about that in in a moment. So, that being said, I've been throwing this term around quite a bit. So let's talk a little bit about what is sexual health. Here, I'd like to hear from.
Al,
Yes, please,
oh, sorry.
please.
There was a question about can you give some examples of sexual health questions?
Mhm. Absolutely. And I will be happy to do that in just a moment. Thank you for that question, whoever put that in there. And that's when we'll get into the conversation. And we're getting right to that. So you're right on cue with me. Thank you so much. So what I'd like to do now, this is where I need to use our chat feature if you can, for those who have access to it. I've been throwing the term sexual health around for a bit, and I'm going to give you both a global definition of it and then a more operational definition of it, and then we're going to talk about how to ask those questions. But when I say sexual health, what comes to mind for you? Don't judge it, don't screen it, don't just let your mind wander. When you hear the word sexual health, what do you think? Throw it in the chat if you would, please, for me.
Could you repeat that question again?
Sure. When you hear the word sexual health, what do you think? What comes to mind for you? So somebody said consent, information, safety, communication, STDs, healthy sexual practices, mental, physical, and emotional well-being in consideration to intimate relationships. Love this. Safe psychoeducation, STD prevention, puberty. Wow, look at all this. This is wonderful. Uh, Relationships, more STDs. Are you familiar with dating violence? That question was asked before. We're going to talk about that. Yep. Awesome. 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 Keep them going. That's wonderful. Wow. Look at all of this, right? These are all components of sexual health in one way or another. Now, again, I want you to be thinking about how often those are part of your conversation, where appropriate. I want to make my boundaries super, super clear. Again, I recognize we have people in various different roles in organizations and agencies. I still believe that sexual health conversations could be integrated into any role. But again, there are going to be limits to that. There's going to be boundaries around that depending on what your role is. And so for some of you, I'm going to ask you to have to make that interpretation. Others, I'll be able to make that fairly clearly for you all. So thank you so much for doing that. Feel free to continue to work within the chat box on that. So I'm going to give you a definition, kind of a world definition that really kind of forms the framework for some of the other work that I've done. This comes from the World Health Organization. They first came up with a definition in 2006. Now, what's fascinating to me is it took to 2006 for even the World Health Organization to have a definition for sexual health. They had definitions for emotional health, physical health, and even spiritual health, but they had not had a definition for sexual health. So this is part of a broader definition that they came up with. Sexual health is a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being in relation to sexuality. It is not merely the absence of disease, dysfunction, or infirmity. Sexual health requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. For sexual health to be attained and maintained, the sexual rights of all persons must be respected, protected, and fulfilled. Now, that's a bit more a layered definition than most of us would probably have. I think it's a wonderful definition. I think it is important to know that it took years for the World Health Organization to come up with this. And there are still many organizations, agencies, and even countries that do not agree with this definition of sexual health. So super important for us to know that this is still a field where there is much contention around how we define it and who even should have access to it. Really interesting. This just quickly, because I have a feeling you're all going to be able to do this really easily. Just on that last piece, being tangential for a minute, one of the most contentious phrases in this whole thing was the sexual rights of all persons must be respected, protected, and fulfilled. There was challenge to that internationally. Any guess as to there were at least two populations of people that some organizations, agencies, or even countries said should not be included within that, that they should not have the same sexual rights as other people. Any guess as to two populations of people that were presented as the ones, trans and queer folk? Yep, that was one of them. That people other than cisgendered heterosexual people. So that was a source of major contention. And I'm trying to think. Minors was a one in some countries. It was not one of the bigger arguments, but it was raised in some countries, particularly agrarian countries, where many times children in the family are seen as property of the family and therefore not entitled to rights as other people are. So that argument was made for sure, but most of you got it, and it was women. That was the big one. That were many people that said, nope, not true. Women should not be entitled to the same sexual rights as everyone else. So we are talking about still in 2026 that we are kind of fighting these battles, that the rights of all people need to be respected. Again, one other thing from that definition to call out, as I mentioned earlier, not merely the absence of disease, right? So in our field, not merely the kind of addressing the trauma. Well, that is super important, but that's not all of it. There needs to be more of the conversation. We're ending the conversation too soon. All right, so now let's move to what you were, I think, hoping for. Again, there's other slides in here. Feel free to take a look at that. Now let's get to these conversation skills, right? What does it look like? How do we do it? What gets in the way of us doing it and having these conversations, even if we want to, right? There are some people that don't feel it's appropriate at all. I hope that, some of the conversation today might change a little bit of that. I'm not grandiose to think that that's going to change it dramatically. But even for folks that want to, then there is remember our early poll. Many of us come from a place where we didn't get these ourselves, so we don't know what it looks like. So again, from a practical, pragmatic point of view, I think the first issue that we have to look at is judgment. In addition to our own information and our own feelings of incompetence, which are ours to then address. If I don't feel comfortable and confident around sexual health conversations, then I need to go address that. I need to go read some books. I need to go to workshops where I'm getting good sexual health knowledge in the gap areas that I have, first and foremost. That's not the client's responsibility. That's not my supervisor's responsibility. That's my responsibility to fill in the sexual health gaps I have in my own learning. Yeah, it was frustrating that my parents didn't talk about it, but they didn't. And now it's my responsibility to fill in what I need to know. So that's first. But then when we get to inviting somebody in, thinking about our judgment. Judgments, as I mentioned before, are the biggest obstacles to sexual health conversations. Our kids in particular are scanning and screening all the time for that look in our eye, that change in our body movement, the intonation in our voice. I mean, they are reading. The kids I work with are so perceptive. And we'll do a little trauma parallel process here. We know that one of the things that happens for kids that have experienced trauma as well, one of the ways that they may respond to that is through things like hypervigilance. Again, for folks that are not clinicians, hypervigilance is when we have kind of the way I describe it to kids, we have all of us in us have a kind of a radar system that comes with our bodies. It's a really great thing. It comes with the whatever model you got, you got one. So it's a radar system that's always looking for anything out there that could be scary or dangerous, and it protects us, right? And that's good to have. But for people that have experienced trauma, that radar system is on full alert 24/7. It doesn't know how to shut down because somebody's already violated that. And so it's always looking for risk and danger, and it's way overwhelming. And so that hypervigilance can kind of be there. So the kids that we work with are always scanning. That's the nature of what they've experienced. And they're scanning for our judgment as well. We do an exercise in the skills-based training where we have people kind of think about, I give them an actual example of something and then ask them to, it's all done privately. They never ask to share with anybody else, but in this scenario, write down your judgment. try to not even judge your own judgment. Being honest about what you thought when you heard this anecdote that I give them, and write down your judgment and see what it feels like to just be honest for a minute about your judgment that you own. Now, you'll notice in the title of this slide, it does not say to be non-judgmental. That is a phrase I don't use. It's a phrase I don't encourage. It's a phrase I don't even support, because I don't think that's humanly possible. We are judgmental, and judgment isn't a bad thing all the time. We need to be judged. We need to judge certain things. Most of us are in our jobs because we make good judgments, and that's how we got our job, and that's why we do what we do. Judgments aren't always a bad thing, and they come with being human. And so to aspire to be, I love when I'm interviewing candidates, particularly fresh out of college, it tends to be, right? And they come in and, I ask them to tell me one of your strengths. I'm the most non-judgmental person you want to meet. And, my internal dialogue, I don't say that to them. I want to be respectful where they're at. But my internal dialogue is, then I don't want you working for me because I do not want somebody that doesn't know how to make judgments here. You got to make judgments, right? But it's about, am I aware of the judgments that I make? And when I am, do I have the ability to move them aside temporarily? This is so important in sexual health conversations. I ask a kid to tell me honestly about what's going on, and when they do, I begin to have a reaction. Now I have to find a way to slow myself down and go, okay, wait a minute. You invited that in, or maybe you didn't. Maybe they shared anyway. And now they're telling you something honestly about who they are as a sexual being. What's going on for you? Can you hold that for a minute? Can you push that aside and just try to stay present? This is hard. I'm a reflective supervisor, so I work very hard on reflection, which is all about just listening and reflecting back what you heard, not suggesting, not changing, not criticizing. Even with all those years of reflective training, it is still hard for me sometimes, particularly in sexual health conversations, not to have my judgments kind of welling up. So again, I don't ever think, oh, I shouldn't have those judgments. I think, oh, there they are. Okay, that's that. That's that old sort of thought in your head. And it may be an actually accurate thought, right? But that's not what's important now. What's important is that the person talking to me believes that they can tell me anything and they don't have to navigate that judgment. They don't have to worry about what that judgment is. And that takes a lot of practice. I would ask many of you to think about it probably was in a sexual domain. It might not have been, but think about during your upbringing, a time when you were engaged in some activity and your parent or guardian or someone else caught you in that activity and it induced a sense of shame in you. Now, what I'm going to ask you to think about in that is, do you even remember what was said? Now, some of you might remember exactly what was said. My guess is that a lot of you would say, I don't remember what was said, but I remember the look. I remember the look on that person's face, and it's still with me, right? Boom. That's how powerful our judgments can be. And we carry that with us. So if we are going to invite others in to having a sexual health conversation, we need to practice and be aware that it is going to bring judgments up for us. That's not bad, but we have to find a way to see if we can move them aside while we're having that conversation. We want to be curious without being critical. I had an amazing opportunity a number of years ago, Doug Braun Harvey and myself, to train Los Angeles County child welfare workers, over 4,000 of them over a course of 2 years, in how to have a sexual health conversation with kids in the LA County system. Public health nurses as well. So it was a great, wonderful group of folks that we got to train. And as we were training them on sexual health conversations, we started to hear these stories over time, and it became interesting. Then it became a question that we asked the audience as we went forward. We started to hear these stories over time about the one place where if a kid was going to talk to a social worker about some aspect of their sexual health, the one place that that probably would happen, where the social worker and the kid were when a kid might disclose something or ask a question, or say something related to their sexual health. Let's play with this one and throw it in the chat box to keep you all awake. Any guesses as to physically where was the one place the social worker and a kid were more likely when a sexual health conversation came up? So throw it into the thing. I'll read them in a minute. I see that people are entering it. It's fascinating, fascinating, fascinating. Uh, yeah, amazing. Cool. You can keep them going. The vast majority of you absolutely got it right. In the car, in the car, over and over and over again. That's what we heard. It happens when we're in the car. Now, at first, we just thought, isn't that funny and interesting? But then as we thought about it, it makes perfect sense to me. I'm going to ask this because I'm tired of listening to myself. Anybody that guessed it right would be willing to come on and talk for a second as to why did you guess that? What was your thinking behind that? And somebody wants to, Haley or Michelle, if you want to screen for me to see if anybody raises their hand or puts a little icon that they're willing to talk, because I can't multitask that much. Anybody willing to just say why you guessed on that?
We have Christina.
Okay, great. We'll take the first one that we got. Christina, I
Hi.
didn't see many, so I hope.
Um, there's just no interruptions. It's just uninterrupted time, and you're trapped in there. And it's just a more easier, less pressure time for anyone to have some conversations.
Yep. Great. Thank you for that, Christina. And I think one other person, did I see Ruth?
Ruth, yeah.
Yep. Ruth, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think Christina's spot on, but I would also say that you're not looking at each other. You're looking ahead. And I think that really takes the pressure off of a kid. And it just you always sort of I think that being in the car sort of helps you enter into this liminal space where you feel more protected, you're not looking at each other. It's different.
Yep. I love it. Thank you so much, both of you. Spot on. Absolutely. And again, this is good. Our way of looking at it as well. This wasn't a right or wrong answer, but we think there are some elements as we thought about it more, and you both pulled out most of them there that are crucial and important for us because they can be replicated outside of the car. But I think what the car domain, as Christina and Ruth pointed out, a couple of things. First and foremost, related to what we're talking about here, many times it is because the kid is not looking in our face, right? Hopefully, the social worker is driving and their face is facing forward on the road, so the kid doesn't have to navigate whatever expression that social worker feels when the kid says whatever the kid wants to say, right? So I'm not having to deal with the judgment of the social worker. Secondly, I think one of the things is there's a perception of confidentiality. We're in the car, nobody else can hear us. Now, while we all try to achieve that in other ways, social workers many times, unfortunately, are stuck with having to do their sessions in a home visit or in a school where even if they have a separate room, it's still not totally safe, totally quiet, and the kid knows that. But in a car, it feels like it is, right? So the perception of it being confidential, the perception that I don't have to deal with the judgment of the other. Another thing is that the car ride is probably time limited. They know where they're going and how long it takes. So I decide when I want to drop the sexual health question or statement into the conversation because I know we're 10 minutes out before we get to where we are. So I'm going to drop it now so that I get to control how long we talk about it. Because then we have to get out of the car, so the conversation is over. So I think there's many aspects of that car domain that we can look at and create even when we're not in a car. As Ruth mentioned, that direct eye contact, a lot of times for the kids that I work with, not everybody, um, I don't believe in a lot of kind of gender typing here, but it tends to be for my clients that identify as male. Many times they do much better at these conversations when they and I are sitting or standing side by side and looking forward and not looking directly at each other. That tends to be a little bit easier for them to have that kind of conversation. So I might create that dynamic if I'm talking about sexual health in particular, where it's going to be a little dicier, right? Giving them full control of we can talk about this for as long or as short as you want. But the judgment piece, back to what started us on all this, the judgment piece is really important for us to kind of look at because the minute a kid or even an adult senses our judgment, oftentimes that's the end of the conversation. So no matter what else we do, we've lost that opportunity. Okay. I want to go into some skill sets and then one other thing, and then we'll get to questions. I want to leave much more time for questions today because I have a feeling that's going to be even a richer part of the conversation. I showed you earlier the World Health Organization's definition of sexual health. I mentioned Doug Braun Harvey. He and his colleague Michael Vigorito back in 2016 took that World Health Organization definition and several others, the Pan American Health Organization and several other organizational definitions of sexual health, and they compared and contrasted them. And what they found, interestingly enough, is if you look at like 5 or 6 international professional organizations that are looking at defining sexual health, you could actually winnow it down to 6 fundamental principles. That all of those definitions have these 6 fundamental principles in one way or another incorporated into them. And so they developed what they call the 6 principles of sexual health. I love these 6 principles. I'm going to suggest to you, you can use them in many ways. I have used them as a basis for my conversation with my clients. I've used them as a basis for my conversation with the parents of my clients. My clients, particularly parents, have used them as a basis for their conversation with their kids. Many times when we say, do you have sexual health conversations with your kid? People will say, I want to, but I don't know how to. Or I'm not a trained professional around all these questions around sexuality. Now, again, we're differentiating sexual health from having, a sex ed conversation. That's a component of sexual health is knowing how our body works. But sexual health is much broader than all of that. And many times people don't know how to begin it. So I'm going to take you very quickly through these 6 principles and suggest that they may be one way in which you can construct this conversation with whomever that you're working with. And I'll tell you some ways that people have used these afterwards in their organizations and agencies as well. So the first principle is consent. That's a kind of a universal one in all of the definitions across the board. That in order, sorry, this is the problem with me riffing. One other thing I want you to pay attention to is that I've been using over and over again is sexual health, right? Not healthy sexuality. Super, super important to distinguish that. Healthy sexuality implies healthy and non-healthy. It's a binary, right? And that can be very subjective and that can change over time. Most of us right now are engaged in some aspect of our sexual lives that at one point in time might have been considered unhealthy. So healthy and unhealthy are not terms that I look for when around sexual. We are talking about sexual health, not healthy sexuality. Sexual health is an aspirational kind of journey. There isn't an end to it. We are constantly striving to find the balance. And these 6 principles work in conjunction with one another. We don't get to pick and choose. I'll take 3 of the sexual health principles and the others I get to ignore. We're talking about at any point in time when I am assessing where am I around my sexual health, can I look at these 6 principles and feel like, okay, yep, I'm okay there, I'm okay there, I'm feeling good there. So first one is consent. Is what I'm doing consensual? Do I know what consent is? This is super important for a lot of times the younger kids that we work with. Do they even understand the concept of consent? And many times they don't. So making sure that a kid understands consent. And that changes over time, and that has to be done in a very developmental way. I work with 4 and 5-year-old kids, or I used to work with 4 and 5-year-old kids. I can give them Webster's dictionary definition of consent, which will go right over their head. They have no idea what the heck that means. So I have to apply it in a different way. And so for me, consent might be, I want to play Candyland with you today, but in this room, we only play games when we both consent to play them. And so that means I want to play and you want to play. If you don't want to play, then we don't play. If I don't want to play, then we don't play. So do we both want to play? And that's a word called consent. Now the kids still, the consent thing is like, let's just play Candyland. Geez, all I want to do is play Candyland. You need all that stuff. But I'm planting the seed for what consent is at a developmental level that might make some sense. So that later on, if and when we talk about the fact that consent was violated for them, they at least have some fundamental element of what it is. So consent is the ability to agree to what we are and have the capacity to agree to the behaviors or the interactions that we're about to engage in. So that's principle one. Acting up here. Second principle of sexual health is in order for it to be sexual health, it has to be non-exploitive. Now, non-exploitation and consent often get merged as if they're the same thing, and people use them interchangeably. And they are very different. And it is important for everybody to understand that. Many times, particularly for adolescents that I've worked with, I have adolescents say to me, I said yes. It was totally cool. Yeah. I was 13 and, she was my English teacher, but I was bring it on. Absolutely. So it was totally consensual. Now, I could argue till I'm blue in the face about, first of all, you don't have the legal capacity to give consent and blah, 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 blah. But that's all lost. From that kid's point of view, I agreed, and that's consent for me, and I did it. Now I might want to suggest the idea of exploitation. And that is when somebody uses their position of power to get you to do something that you might not otherwise have done. Now, a 30-year-old teacher, 13-year-old student, she's got other choices in life, right? You think the fact that she was your teacher, she was in a position of authority, she was older, any of those things might have been a factor in what happened here. Might slightly suggest that, right, in my work. That's exploitation. When somebody uses their position of power and authority, and it can be in any level. This isn't just somebody's physical power and authority. It can be their organizational power and authority. We see this in religious organizations or other places where there has been history of exploitation, that somebody has used their position of authority within the organization to get somebody to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily have done. Exploitation can be played out in many other ways as well. I can exploit somebody because they're hungry and they need food. So they're willing to do whatever I ask them to do because they need that food. But they would never have said yes to that otherwise. So non-exploitation is what I'm doing, exploitive or not. If we really look deep and hard, I would suggest most, if not all of us, at times have been engaged in exploitive experience of our own. We have used our position in some way. We haven't been totally honest with somebody about what was going on there and used that position of power and authority. So exploitation is a tough one to be able to look at. Third principle, and I'm going through these really quickly, I know, but just so you get the basic foundations, again, I'll give you some resources if you want to look into these more in more depth. Third principle of sexual health is honesty. Am I being honest about what's happening here? When we are in a sexual situation, am I being honest with my partner? Am I being honest about what I want? Am I being honest about what I don't want? Am I being honest about my history? Am I being honest about a behavior pattern that's going on here or not? This one, in some ways, feels like the easiest one, and for most people is the most difficult one. We all have ways that we kind of skate around honesty at times because sometimes being fully honest is uncomfortable, is shame-inducing, is really difficult. And again, that's why these are aspirational. So I'm going to try to be more honest with my partner the next time. I'm going to try to be more genuine about what I want or how that felt or what I'm doing. The next principle is shared values. And this again relates to we're talking about this related to sexual health. It doesn't mean that you have to have your values around other things all have to be in alignment. But how I approach myself as a sexual being, are my values and yours the same? An example of this, I used to use this great clip from oh, I almost blanked on the name. Wonderful movie that came out probably now 12, 15 years ago called Pariah. If you ever get a chance to see it, a beautiful, beautiful movie. I love that movie. Anyway, there is a scene in Pariah where a young woman, a 17-year-old high school young woman, has a sexual experience with another young woman in her class. And afterwards, the kind of the fallout from all of that. And the fallout is because one of them went into that sexual experience thinking it was just going to be a cool way to kind of explore what it was like to have sex with another girl. And that's what she wanted, was just to explore that. It was her exploration process. The other young woman had strong feelings for this person and was agreeing to be sexual with her, thinking it was part of maybe the beginning of a meaningful, intimate relationship. Now, neither of them talked about it. They just found themselves in this situation where they ended up having the sexual interaction and then realized that they had different values around what that meant. For one, it was just pleasure and curiosity. For the other, It was about meaning and connection. And then all of the hurt and pain of that because they didn't talk ahead of time about what is this for you? Why are you wanting this? Why am I wanting this? So having those conversations around shared values. While that may seem really deep and complex, actually this is one of the six principles that I most love doing with adolescents. Remember where adolescents are by and large. It is that stage of development when you are starting to figure out your broader value system, right? What do I believe in separate from my family? It may be highly influenced by my family and my community, but who am I as an individual and where are that? So when I would work with kids and say, okay, around our sexual health, what do you know about your sexual values? They love to dig into that. So think about that. Are there ways, is that appropriate conversation for the work that you do? But don't shy away from it. You might be amazed at the willingness that individuals have to talk about that. Prevention and protection. So prevention from STIs, HIV, and unplanned unwanted pregnancy. And so do I have the information? Do I have access to the resources around that? And am I following through on what I need to do in order to protect myself and my partner or partners? Just terminology thing here. I saw it in the chat. I'm not criticizing in any way. But STIs and STD, you'll hear me use STIs in the chat. Many people use STDs. STD is a sexually transmitted disease. STI is a sexually transmitted infection. Most folks, what you see first and what you're dealing with most commonly is an STI. So an STI is the initial stages of a disease. Most of the time that is apparent and dealt with prior to when it hits the disease stage. That's much farther down and it's the life of its continuum in our body. So STIs are sexually transmitted infections. So just a little side note there for sexual health language. And the sixth principle is pleasure. Now, this is the one that really differentiates. This is, I often say, you know you're having a sexual conversation when pleasure is finally incorporated. This is also the one that causes the most amount of woof from folks, particularly when we're talking about kids and adolescents and children. And yet, I would still argue that pleasure needs to be an important component of these conversations. At its core, um, sexual health is about pleasure. Oh, I'll do this one just to keep you awake again. Let's do one more quick chat one here. This one I'm going to love to see. What is the number one most frequent sexual behavior that human beings experience? The number one most frequent sexual behavior of human beings. Throw it in the chat box. It'd be interesting to see how many of you throw it in the chat box. Ooh, kissing, kissing. Okay, kissing. Interesting where you all went. Great. Love it, Emily. I wish that was the answer. Cool. All right. So I got it. Um, Interesting. I'm not going to argue with kissing. I would suggest that kissing isn't always a sexual behavior. So depending on the context of it. In the context of my question, the answer is actually masturbation. So masturbation is the most widely practiced sexual behavior across the planet. And the main reason, the main motivator behind masturbation, not always, but most of the time, is pleasure. And yet we don't talk about it. Kids understand the pleasure principles of their body much earlier than they even understand the words or the concepts related to how their body works. So the idea that we shouldn't talk about sexual pleasure with kids, somehow we are protecting them or we're protecting ourselves, is really a misnomer. Kids know that it feels good. They do. They just need somebody to help them understand how. Now, that doesn't mean that there is no boundaries around how we have those conversations. Obviously, there have to be limits. It has to be developmentally appropriate, depending on how you're working with a family conversation around that, but acknowledging that sex should feel good. That is its intent, right? Is important for kids to know, particularly the kids that we work with, where sex may have only hurt or harmed or been a cause of fear or shame, to understand that sex has a whole nother arena to it when nobody's ever told them that. So those are the six principles from Braun and Vigorito. you can look them both up. They wrote a whole book on the 6 principles of sexual health, so that's out there for you. What you're seeing here is just a simple depiction. I've worked with several agencies that have actually taken the principles and made artwork out of it. Each of the 6 principles has its own artwork. There's a great agency in San Antonio, Texas that did that, and a couple of other places. They have them posted, just the words, they have posted in their offices, just as a way to start the conversation. So somebody comes in with, they don't even put the principles of sexual health, they just have those words. And what a cool way to start a conversation when you don't know how to start it. To have somebody say, wow, what are those 6 words and why are they on your wall? All right, we've started our sexual health conversation here. Those are actually what are called 6 principles of sexual health. What do you see up there? How did that feel to see those words? What did you relate to? What did you connect to? Now you're starting a sexual health conversation already. And then you may elicit some conversation around them. So that's one way that those could be used if you wanted to, but those are there for you. So which of these 6 principles do you already address in your clinical practice? Which ones are hard to talk about? And what makes them hard? So just a couple of things to think about. We're not going to take 4 minutes to do that, but I just want you to kind of think about that a little bit for a moment. Then we're going to do one last thing and then kind of hear from you. Let's see. These conversations matter for everybody. We know that. They reduce shame. They can be a protective factor, and particularly for our kids here, to help them understand. Many of them don't understand how their body works, don't realize they should have full rights to consent and non-exploitation. It helps them for future relationships. Many times our kids don't know how to be a sexual being other than to submit to what somebody else tells them to do or to avoid sexual interactions altogether. And those shouldn't be the only choices that somebody has. They should have the full range of choices that everyone has. All right. So with that, I think the rest I will let you kind of work through. Here's some quick language that you might want to think about for parents and caregivers. I've given you about 4 questions. There's many more, but things that you might want to ask. Are there questions your child has asked you about their body that you'd like help addressing? Are there places where you as a parent feel inadequate in addressing some of those? And might that be part of the reason that you haven't brought those questions up? For kids, asking, do you know your body parts? Even something like that at a small age. Can you name all the different parts of your body and accurately? I know most of you know this because you work in the field, but so many times kids are given euphemisms for their body parts, and that is so dangerous. It seems cute within the family, to call parts of your body, your toy box. I've heard it called your toy box, other sorts of names. Oh my God, so horrible. Just in terms of because many times when kids want to tell us that something's going on, if they use the wrong language, we may miss it. We may think that they're talking about something innocuous when they're really trying to tell us something really important and serious. So important that they have that. Again, you can look through all of these. There's some suggestions in there. Talking to adolescents, how comfortable are you talking to your parents about your body? Is there anyone else in your life that you could talk about if you had a question about your sexual health? Um, where do you go to get your sexual health information? It's a great sexual health question to ask. If they say the internet, that could be good. Where? Where? And do you know if that site is reliable? And is it medically accurate information? So these are all sexual health questions that can be asked for others and your clients. At the Chadwick Center that I work in, not to tout my own organization, but I am quite proud of them. 2 things. First of all, in the state of California, we now require that social workers make sure that any kid in the child welfare system in the state of California recognizes and understands that they have right to sexual health information. So that was great. That started in 2017. The Chadwick Center has implemented sexual health questions into their clinical assessment. So they start with a kind of an understanding as to why we're doing this. They let parents know that we think sexual health is a crucial component of trauma treatment. And we are going to talk about issues related to sexual health in the course of the treatment. And we want that parent to know that and to talk about how that feels for them and what objections or concerns they might have. Many times we find is they don't object at all. They are actually relieved that somebody's finally going to start this conversation. Now, again, we also don't just take full responsibility for that. We encourage the parents and the families to have those conversations, but we will help support them and supplement that. Here's a list of just some of the questions that we put in the assessment for parents and caregivers, Do you have any questions about the therapist using accurate, medically and anatomically correct language? Yes or no? Do you feel comfortable having conversations with your child regarding their physical and sexual health? So we want to get a sense of how this is here. And Chadwick just implemented this within the past year, and I'm so, so proud of them that they're now making it a standard part that is asked of every kid that comes to our agency. These are even kids that come because they've come from families with domestic violence or community violence. Anybody. We just believe that asking about sexual health is important to all kids. So shout out to my organization. All right. So with that, let's do some questions. I'm going to take this down. So you're going to be stuck here with, there we go. Great. So did we have some in the Q&A box, first of all, and then we can get some live and in person as well. So I'm going to pivot over to my colleagues to let me know where we are.
So we don't have any in the Q&A
Oh,
box, but I'm wondering if folks have questions right now that they would like to ask. I know someone asked if they will receive a copy of the slides in your follow-up email. They will, and we also provided it as a link as well here.
great. Thanks for that. So what's this bringing up for folks? Questions, even just reactions. I'd love to hear. Again, this is the challenge of not being in the room with you all, where we could have that kind of more real conversation, but we can do it here. What's this brought up for you? Is it bringing up questions? Is it bringing up concerns? Is it bringing up affirmation? I'd be curious to hear from you. And if anybody wants to speak out loud, love to hear voices. Oh, Emily's raising her hand.
I
Please,
guess
Emily.
I'm curious from the like the clinical realm as like a therapist,
Yeah.
how do you determine the line between what is like within the scope of therapists to talk about in terms of sexual health and wellness and what is moving into like sexual educator territory and how we sort of stay in our lane with that and like where we're just inquiring, where we're educating and where we need to refer out to somebody who is actually like a sexuality or sex educator.
Great question, Emily. Thank you so, so much for that. And really, really important. And I made just a passing reference to that earlier. So I'm happy that you're allowing me to speak some more about that. Right. Sexual health is different than sex education. Sex education is a component of sexual health, but it is different from all of that. So I'm not suggesting that all of you need to be sex educators. That is a skill set that I have tremendous respect for. I'm not a sex educator. That's why I think things like the six principles, Emily, sort of guide me a bit. If I'm talking within those domains, right, I'm talking about sexual health. Within those domains, if a kid starts to disclose to me that I don't even know, what the names of my body parts are, now we're getting into sex ed, right? So that's where I might inquire, okay, where do you get your information from? Is this something you can ask your parents about? If not, then let's talk together about, you just asked a really good question. And that's about how your body works. And I'm here to help you with kind of the emotions and the feelings. When you have questions about how your body works, let's see if we can find somebody that can answer that question for you. Do you feel comfortable with your doctor? Is there a nurse at your school that might be helpful in answering that kind of question? Is that something you can ask your parents, right? Moving to, as soon as it becomes about sort of the logistics of how my body works and the anatomy and around all of that, that's sex ed. And for some of us on this call, that will be your purview because I know we have nurses and other folks. For those of us in the mental health arena, that's, unless we're trained in that regard, that's not ours. So, but what I want to do is to make sure that they then have a bridge to make sure they get the right information from the right professional. Side note to that, Emily, it wasn't your question, but it lets me bring this out. I asked that question once of a kid. He was wanting to do some things around protection. And I asked him if he had talked to, I knew he had a pediatrician, if he had talked to his pediatrician about it. And the kid was, I don't remember, 13, 14 years old. He came back to me the next time and said, I asked my doctor, and my doctor said I was too young to have sex. And so I shouldn't be asking him about how to get access to whatever it was that he wanted at the time. And that, for me, what I had to say to that kid is, I'm sorry you had that experience. I'm really sorry you had that experience. Doctors are like everybody else. We bring our own judgments into this at times, and you were dealing with that doctor's judgment. And so what I want to do is, with the permission of your parents as well, if you're okay with that, we want to find you another doctor that's going to be a place where you can you can ask those kind of questions and get the answers that you deserve to get. So let's not always assume just medical providers are free and clear of their own judgment. That can happen happen there as well. And that's why it's important to ask, do you have a medical provider that you feel comfortable in asking these questions of? And it might not be that the discomfort not be the kids. It might be, I was comfortable. It was the medical provider that was not. Okay, then we need to find you somewhere else. I kind of went all over the place, Emily. Was that generally helpful in any way?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. It's a great one. I'm also going to steal Emily's question and make another one out of it because embedded in that is, and I don't know, Emily, whether you're in private practice or in an agency. If you are in an agency or an organization of any sort, it is also really, really important that you have this conversation with your administrators when you are talking about sexual health. You do. I love the what Doug calls the sexual health angels, right? The people that want to do this and are doing this and are out there doing this. But I do caution you to be careful if you work in an organization or an agency. Does the agency know that you're having these conversations? Will the agency support you? You don't want to be hanging out there on your own and having a liability issue there for some reason or another. So the organization needs to know that we firm and endorse that we firmly believe sexual health conversations are an important part of our protocol. And therefore, yes, as long as you're within the purviews of whatever we set up for that, we encourage you to have that conversation. But protect yourself as well in your organizations and agencies. There can be fallout for that. Other questions?
One of the questions in the chat said, when is the skills training and how can we sign up for it?
Well, yeah, I'm really not here to market that, but I would be happy if folks are interested in more skill set stuff. I don't do as much of those anymore, but I have colleagues that do. So my email address is on the PowerPoint. Feel free to email me, and I can get you in touch. Also, depending on where you are geographically, I have folks that do it in person. I do have some that do it on Zoom as well. But I do have colleagues that do some great skill set stuff around sexual health conversations. And I still do a few of them now and then as well. So if you're in Hawaii, I definitely would consider that one. But but I have other colleagues for sure that will. Yeah, and so part of what goes into those, just really quickly, I did allude to that. I think in a good sexual health training skill set one, the first part is almost the first hour and a half, if we, depending on how long we do it for, is really all about ourselves. And I give what's called a sexual health inventory. That was developed I think also University of Minnesota. And it really asks us to just look at ourselves and our judgments around ourselves. It asks questions like, I'm trying to remember some of the sexual health inventory questions. I feel shame about parts of my body. I've been told that what I do sexually is sinful. There's a whole series of things that you just done privately, but you just kind of look at yourself and where you are around your own sexual health. So that's the first part of the training. The next part of the training is judgments and how to recognize our judgments and how to find ways to kind of move our judgments aside temporarily for the conversation. The third part is the sexual health principles. And then the fourth part is an actual, we have, in addition to the six principles, we have seven sexual health words that we suggest might be helpful in a sexual conversation and how to get more comfortable with those words. There are words like sexual pleasure versus sexual behavior, orgasm being an important sexual health word, and we practice utilizing them in interactions. So yes, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to set you up with some of my colleagues or myself around the skills training. Other thoughts, other reactions, other questions? I have a question for you all. So, what's one thing, if anything, that you're taking from this? One thing that it could be something that's just affirmative. It's something you were feeling going into it, and for whatever reason, me saying it kind of affirmed it. Or it could be something that challenged you and that you're thinking more about. Or it could be something that you're going to try. So, what's one thing you might take from this? And I'm going to look in our chats. I like the term sexually transmitted infection versus disease. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, super important. That can be important for our clients as well, right? To think you have a disease when actually it may not be at the disease stage yet. It's semantical, but boy, psychologically, it makes a big, big difference. So I'm glad you're taking that with you. Somebody said that I got a little bit more confidence in approaching the subject with clients. I love that, Ruth. That's like probably the best thing anybody can say for one of my trainings. I do encourage it. And for some of you, this may be a bit of a stretch, but take that stretch a little bit. Again, if you're an organization, making sure your organization knows that as well. But what we have found over and over and over again, and again, I've trained lots of folks who have dealt with lots of clients across the country and across the political spectrum as well, because I know there are politics involved in all of this. But 90% of the time, I'm making that number up, but 90% of the time, our clients and our client families are actually relieved when we begin to introduce this into our work. They really are. They want to do it. Most families don't want to ignore this. They just don't know how to do it. And they feel inadequate. And so they avoid, which is a human behavior. We do get pushback sometimes from folks. I will say using the six principles has helped a lot. When you look at those six principles, there's not that's very controversial on there. The pleasure being probably the only one, and that one I can usually talk a family with a little bit. But who doesn't want their kid to know the difference between consent and non-exploitation? Who doesn't want their kid to know how to be honest? Who doesn't want a kid to know how to protect themselves? I mean, those are kind of universal themes that people can embrace. And so they tend to take away some of that kind of reaction that we get when we generally talk about issues related to sex. Um, I love the idea that affirm that sexual health is not extra. Absolutely. It's an intricate component of overall health. If we are going to be a healthcare profession, if we are going to be a healthcare professional, our sexual health is just as important as our emotional health, our physical health, our spiritual health. They are on equal level and yet often not talked about. Some people enjoyed it. I love that. Uh, great, great, great. This feels really good. I'm glad that it's landed for a lot of you. Letting the most uncomfortable person set the pace of discussion. Yeah, that, when Doug said that, I hear it all the time now. I really, really do. And it doesn't mean that I challenge it all the time. Sometimes I let it go too. And that I work on. And sometimes you do. It's not worth the fight at that point. But I will say, again, not to self-reference here, but I have gotten better at times when I get that sort of pushback. And the least comfort doesn't always come out in the way that you think, right? It isn't that somebody goes, don't talk about that. The discomfort comes out in other ways. Actually, I was in a group supervision yesterday, a reflective supervision I was doing, and one of the people in the room mentioned something that was happening that had happened to her sexually, and everybody laughed. No, that was their discomfort because she took the risk of finally disclosing something sexually that happened and they didn't know what to do with it. And there was this uncomfortable kind of titter around the group, right? That was their discomfort. So I had to decide whether to call that out or not. And I did. I tried to do it appropriately and I tried to match where they were. But it's like, so let's put some words to the laughter there. So and so just discussed something about a part of her life and there was a little laughter. Can somebody tell me what the words are behind that? And it entered into a really great conversation. Some people were like, I was actually really amazed that she did that. And I didn't think I could do that. And it was sort of like, oh God, I hope he doesn't ask me that question because I don't know if I want to go there. Okay, so you were proud of your colleague, but you were a little uncomfortable about, do I have that feeling of psychological safety here that I could do that? That's good to know, right? So let's find different ways that we can express that. Anyway, so the discomfort can play out in other ways other than just, opposition right out of the chute. Somebody mentioned that it's an aspirational journey. Yeah, great. Again, getting away of this binary that it's never done. We're constantly looking at these pieces of who we are as sexual beings, and we're constantly growing and changing in that. What I know about and what I experience and how I understand honesty and sexual pleasure now is so different than how I would have defined it 20 years ago. And if I'm still alive 20 years from now, I hope it's so different then too as I grow and learn and change about who I am and what I want and what matters to me. And so it is something we have to revisit over and over and over again. Anyway, I know we got some closing things that we need to wrap up with you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for being part of this conversation today. It's been an absolute honor. I love my job at Chadwick Center. I love working in sexual health and in the trauma field. And what I love most about it is that I work with folks like you that are in there giving it the good fight and trying to make this a safer world for kids out there. And I can't tell you enough how much I respect that. So thanks for spending a time that you don't often have by being with me today.
Thank you so much, Al. And we're gonna write in the chat, we're gonna have our survey. And that's how you access your certificate for today's training. So feel free to fill that out. And don't worry, if you close out of Zoom, you can that link will still remain open as long as you've opened it prior to closing out Zoom. But we are happy to have you, and thank you so much, Al, for today's conversation.
Thanks.